here's a quote from Laurence Olivier that reminds me of your work,
Oh,
Tom. And I'm not. Oh God, I'm not kidding. I came upon this quote and I thought this really sounds like your work. So it's a quote that Olivier wrote, and he said that an actor should be going for the jugular. He should be like a lion, a leopard, but also a serpent. Now, to that, I say that sounds like your characters in High Rise, in The Night Manager, which just had an amazing finale last night on the BBC. Absolutely. It sounds like Hank Williams. It sounds like Henry V. It sounds like Loki, the god who would be king of us all. I'm wondering if when you're preparing for a role, if you're thinking, does this one go for the jugular or should I let this one wash over me? As you're approaching it, which approach do you like?
I think if I let anything wash over me, my life would be much easier. I can't explain it. I tend to go for the jugular every time. Can everyone hear me, first of all? Is that great? Just the first, theatrical acoustics, stage trained. I don't know how to do it any other way, actually, and I don't know that I've ever been able to do anything. I say it as a sort of, because I'm aware that it can be a strength, but it can also be a weakness because the focus is obsessive, and so when I go for something, I go for it at the expense of everything else, and I love what I do, simply, and I feel so lucky that I'm allowed to do it, and that I get to do it for a living, and cinema and theatre have had such a profound effect on me in my life, and so I always, every time a new script or a new role comes along, I'm motivated by the thought that I won't forgive myself if I don't give it everything, but I do try to choose different kinds of things because I'm interested in the diversity of people, and the complexity of people, and the multiplicity we contain within us. I really think the thing that unites us all in the world is that we are constantly inconstant. And that inconstancy and that contradiction is something that I've always tried to explore with my characters, because I think we do things that we contradict ourselves all the time. There's the Walt Whitman poem, The Song of Myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. I contradict myself. Sorry, I'm digressing, but yes, jugular every time.
Well, we've had the pleasure of sitting the last few nights talking about I Saw the Light, which we'll talk about more in depth in a little bit. But something you said really struck me, which was that about 10 years ago, you had the realization that life is not a dress rehearsal, that this is time to kind of get serious. I'm wondering what it was that preceded that epiphany and how it spurred you on.
Wow. I think I've been very diligent in my training, and tried to listen to the advice of all my teachers and instructors, as a student, as an academic, as a training actor, and I always wanted to do right by them. And I found myself, it's a very scary moment when you're a young actor. Most people find themselves in their early 20s, and everything is possible and nothing is guaranteed. And you start auditioning, and if you're lucky enough, you have an agent, and you start auditioning, and they send you everything from period drama to Casualty to dairy milk commercials. Yep, I went up for a dairy milk commercial when I was 24. And you are thrown into the business and thrown into it at the deep end, and there's no time for doubt or failure, except routinely. That's what happens to all of us. And I perhaps was too careful in auditioning, and I would always get close to landing roles and to booking jobs, and I would never quite get there. And this is a universal experience for all creative people, certainly actors, is that the constant rejection at the beginning. And you have to get used to it, and you have to get thick-skinned about it. And I got so exhausted by I was trying to sort of, because at first you take it very personally, and I thought, well, no one's gonna help me get there. The only person who can do this is me, and I started preparing in a different way, and I sort of stepped up to the plate a little better, I think, because I could feel time sliding away, and I wasn't getting on with life. I just was sort of stuck in this rut of neither acting nor doing anything else. And the experience of being in your 20s is so energetic, and I felt so stagnant, actually. So I just kind of changed everything up, and it worked. Yeah. I'm lucky.
Yeah. At about that time, you were Cassio in Othello with Chiwetel Ejiofor and Ewan McGregor, and you played dual roles in Cymbeline. You got the Olivier Award for your stage work for Best Newcomer. At that point, did you suddenly think, uh-oh, I may get everything I hoped for, and were you kind of fearful of what would come next?
Well, actually, that was the moment. I remember I was coming off a tour of Cymbeline for Cheek by Jowl, the theatre company, and we toured all over the world. We actually came here in May of 2007.
You're at BAM, right?
At BAM, yeah. And we'd been to Moscow and Paris and Reykjavik and Milan and Frankfurt, and then we later did a stint at the Barbican, and we finished in Madrid. And I remember I had done 6 months of touring this show, and I was so tired, and all I wanted to do was just chill. And my agent called me and said, "You got an audition for Othello next week." And I was like, okay. But I knew, he said, Michael Grandage is directing it, Chiwetel Ejiofor is playing Othello, Ewan McGregor is playing Iago, and Kelly Riley is playing Desdemona. And I'd read this play at A-level English, and I reread it, and I knew, for some reason, for the first time, how to play Cassio. And I didn't want to leave anything to chance, so I just learnt the entire part before the audition. And my audition took 10 minutes. And Michael Grandage still remembers that audition. He said, "You came in," because I knew that everyone was going up for that. It was such an amazing opportunity. And Othello was a real moment. It was a very happy time. It was a great production, principally because Chiwetel was so magnificent in the title role, and he led from the front. And so many fortuitous things happened as a result of that production. I remember we were all quite ready. Very rarely we felt very ready to go to open on the day of our dress rehearsal, and the show was ready to go. With the last thing we actually needed an audience at that point. And Michael Grandage said to the company, "Would you mind if I opened the house to people in their final year at drama school, so third-year students from RADA, from Lambda, from Central, from the Drama Centre?" And we were like, "No, not at all." And it was a sort of nice way of saying free tickets, because they probably weren't going to get tickets. And then he said, "Do you mind if I ask a friend of mine called Kenneth Branagh to come and see it?" And so we all went, "Oh, sure, okay." The most sort of, probably the man who's had the greatest impact on the playing of Shakespeare of his generation. And he knew Michael Grandage because Michael, before taking over the Donmar Warehouse, had directed Ken in Richard III at the Sheffield Crucible. And we all went, "Yeah, sure, fine, yeah, absolutely, no worries." And I remember, so Kenneth Branagh came to the dress rehearsal, and he really enjoyed it. And the next morning I received a phone call from my London agent saying, "Ken is doing a radio play for the BBC of Cyrano de Bergerac, and he's playing Cyrano, and he would like you to play Christian." And so that's how I met Ken. And then the following year, Tom Stoppard also came to see Othello, and he had written the adaptation of Chekhov's Ivanov to be directed by Michael Grandage, in which Kenneth Branagh was starring. And they all turned to me and said, "You have to play the Doctor." So I was like, okay. And at the same time, the BBC's casting director had sent me the script for Wallander, and I remember embarrassingly and bashfully meeting Ken Branagh at the costume fitting, and he said, "So I'm calling this my Hiddleston year." And I just thought, well, don't fuck it up, basically. Mercifully, I didn't. And then we became firm friends, and that was when he invited me to audition for Thor, and it was a very open net they were casting. Marvel wanted young actors to play the principal roles who had no previous attachment in the audience's mind, and I got cast as Loki, and that was my foot in the door, so to speak.
I just love that your connection with Branagh expands both stage and radio and TV because of Wallander, and then film. It's like the only thing you guys didn't do together was like the Telegraph. That you're like, you guys hit every possible medium. And is that story true about how you grabbed the water bottle when you had heard that Branagh was directing Thor? You went as your fake prop hammer and went up there and said, think of me as Thor. Is that a true story?
We live in a world that is ruled by the Marvel universe now. There was a time when they'd made one film.
That's right.
And it was Iron Man. And so we were all in during the theatrical run of Ivanov in the West End. It was very exciting. We were just, as a company, we were very excited on his behalf that he'd managed to land this huge directing gig, which none of us knew about. And somebody told me, Gina McKee, who I had most of my scenes with, was playing his wife, and she told me that Ken had got this huge directing gig. And so as the Chekhovian doctor in that play, I had longer hair and a goatee and wire-rimmed spectacles and a pocket watch, and I looked like a very Slavic Russian doctor from the 19th century. As a joke, in the interval, I picked up this empty water cooler and ran up to Ken's dressing room and pretended to be swinging Thor's hammer. It's probably ill-advised, but I did it anyway. And then actually, that was when he said, "Well, actually, don't joke. There's a couple of good parts in there." So yeah, that's how it came about.
Well, we're very lucky that you didn't get Thor and you got Loki, because really, I think that the key to so much of whether it's Richard III or it's any sort of the villain needs to be somebody that is playful and devious, and you find so many rich layers of nuance within Loki. What was the key to him for you, to that character?
Well, Ken and I kind of used Shakespearean villains as a touchstone. It read like quite a Shakespearean script, and the journey of Thor actually was very similar to the journey of Prince Hal in the Henry IV and Henry V trilogy, which obviously he knew very well, having played Hal and Henry V many times. And so Thor goes from a hot-headed, impetuous young prince into being worthy of his title. And similarly, we tried to think about the immaculate and terrifying talent for improvisation that a character like Iago has. Someone who can think on his feet and manipulate every situation to his advantage. We talked about Cassius in Julius Caesar, who is characterized as having a lean and hungry look. We talked about the brothers in King Lear, Edmund and Edgar, Edgar being the favored son of Gloucester, and Edmund being the bastard son, who is driven by some sort of terrible lack of self-esteem to take his father and his brother down. So those seem to be interesting aspects to steal from Shakespeare, really. And then I just had to remind myself I was playing the god of mischief. Which is a hell of a thing to be god of, actually. There's gods of war and thunder and justice, and this guy was the god of mischief. So I knew I had to have as much fun as possible. The devil plays all the best tunes, and that became a cocktail. And then weirdly, from those beginnings, he just emerged. He emerged in costume fittings. He emerged as I dyed my hair black, and I read the first script, and I thought there was a fascinating inside this extraordinary, lavish visual effects, action spectacular. There was a very simple human drama about a father and two sons, and it's one that Branagh talked to us about to Anthony Hopkins and Chris Hemsworth and myself, it was we really worked on that. That inside, Rainbow Bridges and journeys through space and time, that there was actually something people could latch onto that was human and real. It's amazing watching that scene back, by the way. I haven't seen that. So it seems like a long time ago.
One of the great things that hold up about it, though, is that obviously the best villains don't think of themselves as villains. I mentioned Richard III a couple of minutes ago. He thinks he's doing the right thing, and in the Marvel universe as well, it's the same type of dynamic. To them, they're not the villain. They're the one who's just have a different point of view, and it's the one that everybody should listen to, right?
Every villain is a hero in his own mind. And I really latched onto that. He's someone who's actually trying to do the right thing. He just makes bad choices. Even in Avengers, he's still trying to make the right choice. Right. Possible exception of taking over the world with his proto-fascistic tendency. It's funny, I haven't played him for 3 years, but I still have a soft spot for him. I still kind of...
Yeah, I was going to ask, if a lot of actors who have a connection to a character like that, sometimes when they come around again, you're like, they almost think of him as if he's like another guy. Like, that's nice, he's going to be coming around again. A nice guest in the house is going to be Loki. He's going to be coming around. Do you kind of have that feeling that he's sort of like this other guy at this other point?
Yeah, it's so odd because it's so rare as an actor to have a chance to go back to a character. Sometimes especially you create a character and you hope that he makes an impact, or people find a connection, people can recognize something in him that's entertaining or truthful, and very rarely do you get a chance to go back. And I've gone back to him a couple of times, and it is odd. It's like, hello darkness, my old friend, Yeah. We'll see, man. We'll see. Nothing ends in the Marvel universe, so...
You mentioned The Hollow Crown, which is amazing. The BBC production of The Hollow Crown, which is so beautiful. Your approach to Prince Hal, who becomes Henry V. What was your approach to Henry V? I think that performance and that particular production is so beautiful and so exquisite. What was your approach to Henry V?
It was a fascinating time. The hardest thing about that challenge was doing Henry or Hal's journey in reverse. Because of the schedule of Simon Russell Beale, who played Falstaff, we had to shoot Henry V first, and then shoot Henry IV. And actually, because of our locations, we ended up shooting the end of Henry V at the very beginning, and I played the character in reverse order. So by the end, the very last scenes I shot in a 15-week engagement were when Prince Hal is at his youngest and most immature and playful in the tavern with Falstaff. But I'd already done the Crispin's Day speech. I'd already done Once More Unto the Breach, Dear Friends, and that was interesting. Just as theatre differs from film, is you always shoot films out of sequence, as I'm sure you all know. But with a part as complex as that, not to have experienced the beginning before I got to the middle or the end was fascinating, and it was an interesting time. It was Richard Eyre directed Henry IV Part 1 and 2, and Thea Sharrock directed Henry V, and we decided that it had to speak to our own, even though it was part of a tetralogy that was produced by Sam Mendes and being broadcast on the BBC as a celebration of British culture in conjunction with the 2012 Olympics. We felt that Henry V is a play about war. Overwhelmingly, if you read it again, it is a meditation on the spiritual cost of warfare and responsibility, and Henry as a general, in a way, a leader of his army as well as a king, is the most interesting psychological aspects of that play are about the toll on his soul, and the guilt and the shame, and there's a fantastic soliloquy upon the king. Let us our hearts, our lives lay on the king. We must bear all. And we decided that rather than it being a kind of rousing endorsement of warfare, as actually Olivier edited out some of the more brutal aspects of that. He cut out the speech of Henry before the French, before the Castle of Harfleur, where Henry V says some terrible things. He says, we're going to, your fathers taken by their silver beards and their most reverend heads dashed to the walls, your naked infants spitted upon pikes. These are all things he's threatening to do unless they open the gates. And it's martial and it's ugly. And Olivier, in 45, necessarily cut those speeches from the play so that it would be a more of a galvanizing and rousing emotional appeal to everybody, which the country needed. And we felt, Thea and I, that we had to re-include those bits to give dimension to the play's really quite balanced debate about warfare. And that in the way we shot it as well, we discussed that we had a very limited budget, but when we lived in a world in the wake of films like Saving Private Ryan and Gladiator and films like that changed the way audiences relate to action and action sequences, is that people now demanded more verite in their action sequences. They wanted to get up close to be able to feel the intensity of the action, and so we tried to shoot the battle sequences in a different way. But I loved playing it. I mean, the privilege of saying those words on film is very rare, and I love doing it. It was a great experience.
You mentioned darkness a couple of minutes ago. You have a talent for that, for sort of a world-weary morbidity, a heaviness. Obviously, in addition to Loki, there's Only Lovers Left Alive, which I love. There's Crimson Peak. You actually do have a very funny talent for comedy, though. I frankly love your Midnight in Paris, your F. Scott Fitzgerald, and actually, if anybody ever saw those Loki Comedy Central bits that you did in preparation for The Dark World, where you're dealing with a quartet of children. Yeah. Just as formidable as the Avengers. You do have a talent. Would you like to do more comedy? Would you like to do more light things?
Love to do more comedy. I really would, yes. I have something I've been asking to do for a while. I keep telling everybody who, when I'm working, I've got a couple of agents who sort of scour through scripts and new material to send to me, and they always will send me the darkest stuff. I mean, really dark stuff. I was like, guys, come on, romantic comedy. That's what I was up for. Yeah, I love doing comedy. There's a little bit of comedy, sort of surrealist comedy in High Rise.
Absolutely.
And there are funny bits in I Saw the Light. Mm-hmm. But that's where it started for me as a child. If I was ever exhibitionist, it was in the aim of making people laugh. Yeah. It was pratfalls and falling off chairs, and there's nothing like getting a laugh actually. Yeah. So yes, more comedy, please. Yeah.
Do you remember your the first production that you saw, live stage production that you saw as a child?
I was taken to see pantomime, so that was probably the first at Christmas time. And my grandfather, my mother's father, had a wonderful tradition of gathering up his brood, all the troops, all of his children, all of his children's children, at Christmas time to go and watch something. And I remember seeing The Wind in the Willows at the National Theatre. I think Ian McKellen played Badger. I think I might have. Maybe he was definitely Captain Hook in Peter Pan. And then I remember very clearly my first Shakespeare production was A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Barbican, Royal Shakespeare Company production directed by Adrian Noble, with Alex Jennings as Oberon, and it was so joyful and so fun, and I didn't know the story. The first time I had my head sort of blown clean away in the theatre was a production by Richard Eyre of John Gabriel Borkman, the Ibsen play, with Paul Schofield and Vanessa Redgrave and Eileen Atkins. And I remember I was taken to see it by an English teacher, and it was at the Littleton Theatre at the National in London. And in the interval, there were a couple of us there, and he called us aside and he said, "You never saw Olivier, you never saw Gielgud, you never saw Richardson. You are watching Paul Schofield, one of the greatest actors of all time, in what will be his last performance. Treasure it." and it was magnificent. I mean, there was something, people still don't really feel they were close to Schofield, or that they understood his talent and how he pulled out what he pulled out. But I was aware I was in the presence of greatness, and it was a film about a family in pain. And Vanessa Redgrave was so good, and Eileen Atkins as well. And that was one of those life-changing moments where I felt the power of dramatic storytelling to unite a group of strangers. You know, I was in the National Theatre with all these grown-ups, and it seemed that when we sat down at 7:30 like a social occasion, and by 10:30 we all left bonded by a common experience. I really understood the sort of the power that theatre and cinema can have.
Along those lines, one of the reasons you did Deep Blue Sea, the Terence Davies films, which I love, is that it was an opportunity for you to do something about love at a time that you're doing a lot of sort of things with a lot of fighting in it, a lot of either violent stuff, either on stage or on screen, and it was an opportunity to sort of explore the idea of love. Yeah. What did you learn from that production and going into it, that Terence Davies film?
I loved making the Deep Blue Sea, and I loved working with Rachel Weisz. Yeah. She's such an instinctive, warm actor. She's so generous and so compassionate and so human. And for both of us, it was a story about a woman who was trapped between two men, neither of whom could give her what she needed. She, you know, her first husband was kind and considerate, but without passion. And Freddie Page, I was playing a former bomber pilot, was full of passion, but without the sophistication or the constancy. And I always read that as, you know, he was one of those guys in the Battle of Britain who was given definition by his courage and by the experiences of being a pilot. And after the war, didn't know how to readjust. And so he actually, you know, as Terence Davies said to me, you can't put an entire nation in therapy. And that he was basically self-medicating, going to the pub every night and singing and drinking, and therefore couldn't meet Rachel's character Hester at the level she wanted. So actually, it's a tragedy of a love triangle where everybody needs love from the other that can't be requited. And it was a fascinating thing to explore because that's so Terence as well. Anyone who knows Terence Davies' work, he feels that so powerfully, the loneliness of that feeling. And we shot it in something like 21 days in London. Very quick, very small. But it's amazing. You get bonded by those experiences. I saw Rachel recently, and I hadn't seen her for a long time, and I feel like I know her for the rest of my life just by the intensity of that experience.
Speaking of the intensity of the experience, you have prepared for I Saw the Light. It was about 4 years ago, was about the time that this project started first gestating, right? What appeals to you about Hank Williams? Because this performance in this film is so spectacular, and it hits all these levels and all this nuance about a man's life who a lot of us know the music. You may not know the story behind all of them. What appealed to you about Hank Williams?
Well, honestly, when I first read the script, the foreignness of it was part of the thrill. I was born in London in 1981, and Hank Williams was born in Mount Olive, Alabama in 1923. And he was a huge star and changed the face of American music. And part of the excitement of it was the foreign territory. And as I spoke with the director, Mark Abraham, lighting change, moody.
Speaking of darkness.
Sliding you into darkness,
right.
yeah.
Right. We'll be here for a few more hours. That's right.
It's changing the vibe. So I had a Skype conversation with Mark Abraham, and he was most interested in taking the icon off the pedestal, in getting behind the myth to play the man. And Danny Dill, who was an old bandmate of Hank's and the Drifting Cowboys, used to say, legends don't know they're legends when they're being made. They just folks. And I loved that. And I thought, I Saw the Light as a screenplay was two films, really. It was Portrait of the Artist as a young man, and and A Portrait of a Marriage. And Mark's conjecture is that the power of those songs and the enduring legacy that they transmit is connected to the turbulence of his relationships with women. And that he was so young. He was 24, 25 when he had his first hit, and he was 29 when he died. And he did so much in such a short space of time, and he was from the South. He lived a hard life. He was poor. He had nobody around him to anchor him. He was rebellious. He didn't take any shit. And he wrote about things that happened to him in his life, about falling in love, about falling out of love, about being in the doghouse. And people connected to that authenticity and that sincerity in a very profound way. And he changed music. That's what I found so amazing is, I remember listening to Honky Tonk Women by the Rolling Stones when I was 15. I had no idea what a honky tonk was. I just thought it sounded cool. And Mick Jagger and those guys were listening to Hank and listening to honky tonk blues. And so was Bob Dylan, and so was Johnny Cash, and so was Bruce Springsteen. They all start with Hank. Whenever they talk about their influences, they go, well, it all starts with Hank Williams. And so the idea that I might be able to try and represent that was the thing I found fascinating about Hank, I should say, is the tension between his external charisma and his internal vulnerability. He was clearly electrifying on stage. I mean, that's what people say, that this presence, he was like Elvis before Elvis. But he was tortured. He was a tortured soul, and he was an addict. He was an alcoholic. He was on prescription drugs. He was afflicted with spina bifida. And this tension, I found, that's what excites me about acting, really, is, and some people have noticed it, that I would, maybe with all my characters, I try to get underneath the skin or behind the carapace, because I think as human beings we construct an identity which we present to the world, and we all put our best foot forward because that's who we are. But so often behind that is a much more turbulent, much more chaotic vulnerability, which we hide. We hide it with charm and with status and with a sense of style and with detachment. But we're all so vulnerable. And I think if acting has any power, it's to show that vulnerability, and that's what connects people. And not necessarily in what I've done, but I know that's what moves me in the actors I admire, is that they are able to show something very universal and fragile about the human spirit behind a characterization, be they soldiers, be they rock stars, be they demigods, is that we are all bound by our fragility.
And you even had to additionally learn how to sing. I mean, not that you couldn't sing earlier, but it's a...
I couldn't sing earlier.
You couldn't sing?
Let's just put that out there.
Because you learned how to sing and yodel in the Hank Williams style of yodeling, and that was an immersive process in and of itself, right?
Yeah. There comes a time in a man's life when he is called upon to yodel. For some, that happens later than others. For me, it happened when I was 33 years old. It was for me, it was essential. I couldn't see. Some people have asked me, why didn't I lip sync along with Hank? And for me, there would have been a break in my authenticity and my interpretation. Sissy Spacek sang as Loretta Lynn in Coal Miner's Daughter. Joaquin Phoenix sang as Johnny Cash in Walk the Line. If I was going to dress up and look like Hank and speak as Hank and interpret his truth, step into his shoes, I had to sing. Yeah. And the best thing I did was just to get out of my comfort zone in a real way. And I moved to Nashville for 5 weeks before I started shooting. And I lived with this man called Rodney Crowell, our executive music producer, terrific, patient, and respected musician in his own right, who'd seen Hank on his father's shoulders at the age of 2. It was his first memory. And we went to Hank boot camp. And we sang and played every day, and it was terrifying and difficult and joyful, and like anything, you have to just practice and practice and practice. And I'd always said to him, if I were playing an Olympic sprinter, I would need a coach to tell me how many miles a day to run and how fast. And in that respect, I needed him to tell me how many hours a day to sing, and in what way. And we sang the blues, and we sang Howlin' Wolf and Jimmy Reed. We sang John Lennon. We'd sit there. We talk about performance. We talked about Freddie Mercury and Elvis and James Brown. These people who had this presence. What was this thing that unites? What is charisma on stage? Merle Kilgore, who was one of the Drifting Cowboys, said when Hank yodeled, especially in his first hit in Lovesick Blues, he said, that's when they stood up and started throwing the babies in the air. It was clearly this extraordinary kind of sexual connection he had with his audience. It was, it was that Elvis moment. So, yeah, yodeling was pretty scary, but I managed to pull it off.
A side note about Hank that I feel it in your performance, which is that he was one of the, if not the first, musician who had a catastrophic effect on his own life, who died of his own hand. People forget about George Gershwin, died of a disease. Benny Goodman dies in a plane crash. But Hank Williams, when he dies, it dies because of his alcoholism. He's really the first one. And I feel like we feel that in your performance, that sense of almost inevitability. Yeah, right?
It's to me, it's so sad, because there's an interesting debate to be had, is great art at what cost? Especially in music. And you think of the number of extraordinary musicians who have given us something very intense and then have left the building, and have left us too soon. They're stars that burned twice as bright and not for long. Jim Morrison, Amy Winehouse, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix. So there are, and there are actors as Heath Ledger, there's Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Hank was really the first of his kind who seemed to create at such a velocity and such a pitch of intensity that the amount of material and that came out of him during 1947 and 1953, which then went on to change music, and then he left us too soon. And there's a question as to whether are those self-destructive instincts part of the generation of the art? Are they necessary in some awful, tragic way, or is it just that somehow they are corollary to the art? Is there a version of Hank's life, if somebody got him to help him at a particular time, might he have created new work in his seniority that we now don't have? But I did find it fascinating that he was unstoppable. His presence was so full in his songs and in his life, and that's what he sang about. And I think, the darker the circumstances of his life, the more powerful those lyrics. To write a song like Cold, Cold Heart is someone who's deeply lonely, which is so sad because he was so successful and so famous. And there's an interesting question about the isolation of fame, especially at that time, and the corrosive aspects of it if you don't have the armor to protect yourself.
Just by the way, speaking about the accent, your accent as Hank is spot on. You just dipped into another one a couple of nights ago. I heard you do Anthony Hopkins. You have a great talent for imitation, and you have a great ear for accents. Is that something you've always had?
I don't know. It's something I've always done. I remember I had a double tape deck recorder when I was about 9, and I used to do my own radio show. For an audience of one, and I would do at the Tom Hiddleston show, and I would do all the voices. I would do the news and the weather, and I was so fascinated. I loved doing voices. I always have, actually. I've always done impressions, and it comes from love. It comes out of, and it's something that's, I guess, that musical. It is an aspect, I suppose, a musical ear, well, the Anthony Hopkins thing is fascinating. I mean, you saw that clip in that film, and I may have told this story before, but it was an amazing moment that's worth recounting, and Chris Hemsworth and I felt so lucky to be in Thor. We were, picked out of obscurity and suddenly standing next to him and Rene Russo and Natalie Portman and Colin Feore and Idris Elba, and we felt like we'd won the lottery. And Tony, as he insists on being called, invited me to just to have breakfast with him before shooting ended, and he said this extraordinary thing. He said, I see what you're doing. I see what you're doing. It's interesting. I've been there before myself. I see it. He said, my whole life I've played lots of different parts. I've played kings and princes and warriors and butlers and poets, and people stop me in the street. They ask me about one man. Who do you think that man is? And I knew who that man was, and you know who that man is. And he said, it's so fascinating to me because people want their lives to be full of love and laughter and friendship and happiness, and they want to have good lives. They want to have nice lives. They want to be happy. But what they really want is they want to go into a dark room on a Friday night with their friends and family or their loved one. They want to sit in the darkness, and they want to look at artists who are brave enough to stare into that darkness. And they don't have to take it home. And I thought it was such an extraordinary summation of a certain kind of work in music and film. And at the time, The Dark Knight and Heath Ledger's performance was very current the time he shot that film. And I remember thinking, that the intensity of admiration towards that film and towards his performance is we all loved watching it. But there's no way you'd want to meet that person. You wouldn't want that person anywhere near your life. And yet we need actors and musicians and writers and painters who are courageous enough to go there. And Hank was one of those guys who go to that dark place on our behalf and send dispatches back. And I found that very moving, and I think that's absolutely true of Sir Anthony Hopkins. I think he's done that many, many times. So anyway, that's my Anthony Hopkins story.
That's a great story and a great accent that goes along with it. Speaking about tonal changes, the effect of High Rise, I think, it feels very much like it's a tone that Stanley Kubrick would like. It's a satirical, absurdist tone. It's from a J.G. Ballard novel from the 70s. People really have to see it to appreciate it. I won't even do it justice by describing it. But in getting into the absurdity of the situations inside, I saw it in Toronto to a rapturous response. What was it like kind of getting into that world of that sort of absurdist, satirical, but hyper odd and realistic tone?
Again, it felt like new territory. I loved Ben Wheatley's films. I don't know how many people here have seen Ben Wheatley's films. And they're dark, but they're British too. And I remember I saw a field in England. I was in America, I think, and I watched it when it was released. It was released across all platforms at the same time, and I watched it on my laptop, and it made me homesick. There's something very sort of British about Ben, his sense of humor, his inheritance of British culture, and I think it was very important to me to champion British film. And the script came to me, and it's an adaptation of the Ballard novel. And in Ballard, there is provocation laced into that novel. He knew exactly what he was doing. The novel opens with the line, "Later, as Lang sat on the balcony eating the dog, he reflected on the unusual events that had taken place within this huge apartment building during the previous 3 months." And he takes the English middle class, essentially, or the upper middle class, throws them into a building which is a sort of replacement for nature, which will provide for all their needs, locks the doors and keeps them there, and watches the veneer of civilized British manners fall away, to reveal something much more unpleasant. And it's a satire on social mores. It's a investigation of class struggle. It's an investigation of inequality and Britishness, really. And I think Ballard always felt outside British culture in lots of ways. As someone who grew up as a British citizen in Shanghai, but had never seen British soil until he was a teenager. He arrived and didn't understand. He arrived in the 50s after the war and didn't recognize the place he'd been brought up to believe in, and he couldn't believe these little disputes that people had about territory and manners, and so High Rise is a very provocative satire on that, and I enjoyed kind of. I think we all did, actually, because it's a film about indulgence, and these are rather sophisticated characters. I play a physiologist who's trying to live an anonymous life in his 1,000th share of the cliff face. But the building is populated by very genteel professions, by dentists and gynecologists, broadcasters, people in PR, architects, documentary makers. They all have very respectable jobs. And slowly, as the electricity goes off and the lifts stop working and the water is turned off, some darker, more feral truth about these people is revealed, and Ballard is really provoking the audience, and I think, and Ben honoured that provocation in his film, and it is a mad, chaotic descent, in a way that is much more familiar, if people are familiar with the films of Kubrick, perhaps, or Lindsay Anderson, or Ken Russell, or Nicholas Roeg. Those are big heroes for Ben, and they became part of the fabric of High Rise.
You said you love diving sort of into other people's lives, examining the other characters that are going on. I would love to talk about The Night Manager and talk about Jonathan Pine. That particular character, obviously a man who has sort of left a clandestine life behind to be an anonymous hotel manager and then is drawn back into it. What appealed to you about Jonathan Pine and The Night Manager?
Well, first of all, The Night Manager is a novel by John le Carré. And le Carré is, I think, one of the greatest English novelists of the last century. I think he is a master at his chosen form, which is the espionage thriller. And I also think he's one of the great analysts of the British psyche, and the contradictions therein. And that's what the novel is about as much as anything. Story-wise, Jonathan Pine is a former British officer in the army, or soldier rather, and who served in our adaptation in the Iraq War of 2003. And you meet him in 2011 as the night manager of a 5-star hotel in Cairo in the middle of the Arab Spring riots, the popular uprising that fell Hosni Mubarak. And in the wake of a particular incident, he's recruited by the SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, to become a field agent and take down an international arms dealer who is selling standard and chemical weapons to the highest bidder in the Middle East with no moral qualms about the victims of the violence from which he profits. And the astonishing thing about The Night Manager is first of all, it was an incredible character, a character which he's described in the novel as a collector of other people's languages, a perpetual escapee from emotional entanglement, a self-exiled creature of the night, and a sailor without a destination. And that he's given a destination by his moral commitment. And you can feel David Cornwell, which is the real name of John le Carré, you can feel the support of the author behind the moral courage of Pine and Burr, in this case played by Olivia Colman. and his righteous rage against Hugh Laurie's character. Hugh Laurie plays a character called Richard Roper, who has all of Hugh Laurie's attributes. He is charming and affable and sophisticated and urbane, and you want to be in his company. You want to get to know him because you're drawn to him. He's attractive, he's seductive, he's witty, and that sophistication is very appealing. And the brilliant way that Hugh plays it is that you see why everybody loves Roper, but then you see that underneath that is somebody who is a psychotic and a cynic, who believes deeply in the rottenness of the world, and that someone has to capitalize on that rottenness for the greatest financial gain. So he trades in chemical weapons. He trades in death, and he laughs about it. And somehow, Le Carré's anger is very intense. I remember talking to him about it, and that's why I think in that scene, that's the scene with Olivia, that line of Pine's is lifted straight from the novel when Burr asks Pine, "Why did you do it? Why are you here talking to me?" And Pine says, "If there is a man selling a private arsenal to an Egyptian crook in the middle of the Arab Spring, and he's English, and you're English, you do it." As some calling that Le Carré is fury that the inheritor of all the freedoms of British society is using those freedoms and privileges to do the worst things imaginable, to turn our world into a darker place. And I found that the morality in it, apart from the thrill of playing the cat and mouse game that he is so expert at constructing, moving and romantic. As that he's, Le Carré's novels are full of flawed heroes who are haunted by doubt, haunted by moral ambivalence about the hypocrisy of having to do very bad things for the greater good. But there's a deep romance in their solitude, and that's from Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, or The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, or The Constant Gardener. These are people who are driven by a desire to fight the system, and it was just a wonderful thing to be part of.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Hiddleston, you have a dinner reservation shortly.
Okay. It's all right. I can go on. I'm
I will. 3 more questions. Well, I will wrap up.
How long, Luke, do you want us to go on for?
Probably an hour per question.
Okay.
We can do
I
that.
could be here. I honestly can.
We could be here all night.
I have nowhere to be, so I can go on, and I'm enjoying it. So
I will use this. I will
as
say
long
that
as you guys are all still up for it.
I just want to comment that The Night Manager has been a phenomenon in the UK. It starts in the United States April 19th. It is your first spy. This is really just a shameless opportunity to ask you about James Bond. And if of course, given the chance to be James Bond, what would you bring to Mr. Bond that we haven't seen before? It had to be asked.
I couldn't possibly comment. I think it would be ungracious to talk about. I mean, I haven't been asked, so I don't want to talk about. I mean, I wouldn't want to comment on it. And if that ever were the case?
Yeah. It's been called the greatest pub game in the UK, right? As people.
What was that at the back? Thank you very much. Yeah. I'll leave it there.
Then I will play off of the idea of the preparation for I Saw the Light and how much, the other night we were talking about that you and one of your co-stars in I Saw the Light, Ren Schmidt, were talking about the work of a philosopher, Ellen de Botton, in talking about the relationship between Hank and her character. And obviously you're bringing up so many things in preparation for a role. Are there any roles that you've had the least amount of preparation for, but it actually benefited you? What have you had the least prep time for, but you were actually able to jump in and have it work out for the best?
I think F. Scott Fitzgerald in Midnight in Paris. Yeah. I was cast very shortly before I was due to shoot. And Woody Allen, in his unique, inimitable way, didn't want me to read the whole script. He only sent the whole script to Owen Wilson. Every other actor in that film received little piecemeal stuff. And and I had to work out, it was very cryptic. I got these pages and the characters' names in the scenes were Scott and Zelda and Ernest and Gil. And I thought, is that a coincidence or is that Fitzgerald and Zelda? It wasn't made explicit. And I wasn't quite sure if I was being asked to play the F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I couldn't get Woody on the phone. So I just sort of winged it because I was in Paris about a week later, and so I did as much homework as I could on his speaking voice, and I went back and read some short stories and read some of Hemingway's accounts of Fitzgerald. But honestly, and he shoots a short day because he wants to play the saxophone and the clarinet, and have dinner and so really, I remember Corey Stoll, who played Hemingway, said, well, the night I arrived, he said, you basically got 2 takes and you're out. So yeah, I remember just not really being prepared, I felt, to play Fitzgerald, but it all turned out okay in the end.
It sure did. It's a terrific performance. I'm going to wrap up with this question, which is that David Farr, who did the adaptation of The Night Manager, said that one of the things he loves about your portrayal of Jonathan Pine is that as an actor, you really listen and you turn silence into a virtue. Is that one of the keys for you for acting, is really listening and sort of being there and being present?
Yeah, it's so interesting. A lot of people talk about acting as being in the moment, being present, and having the discipline to stay present. And I actually sometimes think that it's not quite that. It's actually about, because sometimes if you're in the present moment, the present moment is it's Friday night, the sun's going down, you're losing the light, the crew are tired, and you have to take yourself out of the present moment and commit to another moment, which is fueled by your imagination, which I always think is interesting because sometimes it's about having the discipline to not be in the present moment, and then once you've isolated the scene that you're in, to really be there with your scene partner. And I do think the best acting I've ever done has been in response to another actor. It's been about the rally that we play together across the net, and that's when acting is the most exciting. When we all do our very solitary homework and our research, and finally you get on set. You get on the ice, you get on the court, and you play, and that's the stuff that you very generously showed before this is if there's anything interesting in what I'm doing, it's because I'm acting opposite Anthony Hopkins or Olivia Colman, or was it a scene? I was in the bathroom. Was it a scene from High Rise with Sienna and Luke Evans?
And
Elizabeth Moss, right? And who's great in that film. And Elizabeth Olsen in I Saw the Light. And the fascinating thing about Pine was I think there is something very active in the way that he is passive. And the whole portrayal felt like a kind of a distillation of all my thoughts about acting and identity is actually Jonathan Pine himself is an immaculate performer. He's somebody who is able to hide behind different masks. He's able to read the signs and the atmosphere and adapt himself to any given situation, but always watchful, always listening. And the fascinating thing about the performance was I was trying to communicate how active his passivity is, that there are more energetic people in the room, whether it's Roper or Corky, as brilliantly played by Tom Hollander, or Jed, or anybody else, that Pine is receding into the shadows, but I needed the audience to see that I was still listening, that I was still watching, that in a way I'm the avatar for them, for the audience in those things. But yes, in sum, the best acting is reacting and listening, and that's the hardest thing to do.
We've been so lucky to have you present with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Hiddleston.
It's a great thing to have rehearsals and just know that you're coming at it from the same point of view. It just means you can be more free, you can play and enjoy it, and I think that's what elevates good work to great work or really exciting or daring work.
Nobody can go into making a massive feature without having done some groundwork. You've got to learn somewhere. It's hard to tell a whole story in that amount of time, and if you can do that, then you've certainly got a skill of some sort, and keep at it.